Hey, all. Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to talk about the general pictured here, George Henry Thomas. I'm sure you students of the Civil War have read plenty of accounts by those who knew him, and they're all roughly the same. The pattern is the same. He was basically the strong, silent type of leader. He's a Union loyal, West Point educated general from Virginia. He was known to the troops as Pap, which suggests a fatherly feel that he must have had that inspired the troops. Some of those young men were old enough to be his son, or he was old enough to be their father. Thomas was known to admirers across the United States as the Rock of Chickamauga for his stubborn defense after the Union Army, commanded by Major General William S. Rosecrans, was hit hard by Confederate forces commanded by General Braxton Bragg. Thomas prevented potential disaster, a potential rout and destruction of that army. Now, one of the Union staff officers that served with Thomas, James Fowler Rusling, I've shared some of his recollections before. He also knew Thomas, and in his recollections, he compares Thomas to none other than George Washington. High praise, perhaps the highest praise. Rusling knew of what he spoke, for he got to know many of the Union leaders, the high-ranking senior officers, among them McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Sickles, Grant, and more. I want to share with you Rusling's recollections from his 1899 book, Men and Things I Saw in Civil War Days. There are four separate excerpts. The first one is a physical description of Thomas, and then there's an anecdote after Chickamauga in 1863, another anecdote at Nashville in 1864, and finally, a summary of his character. Before I begin, two things I want to mention. One of them is this portrait. I chose it specifically. It's from the collection of the National Gallery because it relates directly to Rusling's recollection. I also want you to listen for a mention of this general pictured here. His name is Andrew Jackson Smith, who makes a really neat cameo in Rusling's Nashville recollection. So let's get back to Thomas, and I want to start with Rusling's physical description of Thomas. Here's what Rusling has to say. George Thomas was a Virginian and worthy of the home of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, big-souled, broad-gauged, built on the plan of Plutarch's men, large-framed, clear-headed, judgmatical. I think George H. Thomas resembled George Washington in body, brain, and soul more than any officer I met during the entire Civil War. In some respects, indeed, he was an abler man than our American Fabius. But whether, on the whole, he could have swung things so well as George Washington during our American Revolution may, of course, be doubted. Of course, Rusling has to have some deference to the father of the country. Though a Virginian, Rusling continues, native and to the manor born, and with the air and bearing of a real Virginian, Thomas, unlike Robert E. Lee, did not resign his commission and desert his colors when Virginia seceded or tried to. He graduated well at West Point and served honorably and creditably in Mexico, and now stood loyally by the United States, though tempted much to accept a Virginia or Confederate commission. Doubtless the fact that he had married a New Yorker had something to do with it. That's the physical description in the background on Thomas by Rusling. Now, here's the anecdote, the first anecdote where Rusling relates a little bit it's a note about a post Chickamauga. And it starts with an anxious, as Rusling describes it, an anxious telegram by Grant from Louisville, who was en route from Vicksburg to Chattanooga. Grant says, quote, "Hold on to Chattanooga at all hazards. Will be with you myself in 3 days," end quote. That's his heroic reply, Rusling says. And it was so characteristic of the man, Rusling adds. Now, Thomas replies, quote, "We will hold the town till we starve," end quote. This quote is well known to students of the Civil War, but it's worthy of repeating here. And Rusling notes it came pretty nearly to starving, Thomas's men losing over 10,000 horses and mules, and the troops reduced to half rations before Sherman arrived with relief and Grant got things well straightened out. Now, here's the second anecdote from Nashville. It's in the fall of 1864, and this is where General A.J. Smith, Andrew Jackson Smith, has his cameo. Rusling states, "I had seen and talked with him, Thomas, some days, sometimes several times a day, from his arrival at Nashville on October 3rd, and a cloud of anxious care rested always on his brow. Habitually, during all that period, he wore his military hat pulled down over his grave gray eyes, was reticent and gloomy, but now his hat lifted, his broad brow cleared up, and his strong and massive face began to shine with the fierce light of impending battle. I happened in his quarters the night General A.J. Smith arrived at Nashville by way of the Cumberland from St. Louis with 13 transports and 8 armored gunboats swarming with veteran soldiers, and I shall never forget the scene. It was the night of the Battle of Franklin, November 30th, 1864, and our news of matters there was as yet uncertain. Judge Campbell of the United States Supreme Court, then residing at Nashville, gave a reception that night, and on my way to it, I dropped into General Thomas's headquarters about 9 o'clock to inquire more about Franklin. Thomas, his hat up and face all aglow, handed me a telegram from General John Schofield announcing that he had defeated Hood, putting 13 of his general officers alone and over 6,000 of his men hors de combat. A terrific blow to the Confederates, but was now falling back on Nashville in pursuance of his orders. Thomas eagerly inquired if I had any news from A.J. Smith. I answered no, that I had sent a swift steamer down the Cumberland early in the afternoon to hurry him forward, but it was not yet time for his arrival. Well, Thomas said, if Smith does not get here tonight, he will not get here at all, for tomorrow Hood will strike the Cumberland and close it against all transports. I replied he need not fear, for Smith would certainly arrive soon, and I went on to Judge Campbell's. About midnight, I left Judge Campbell's and, on my way back, dropped in at Thomas's headquarters again, and there I found Schofield and General T.J. Wood just arrived from Franklin, and all three in conference over what was to be done the next day. Wood was still on crutches from a wound received at the Atlanta campaign, but in command of his corps and handling it ably and gallantly. Thomas introduced me to the other two and again eagerly inquired about A.J. Smith. Oh, I replied, he is all right. Just as I came in, I heard his steamers tooting along the levee. And even as I spoke, the door opened and in strode General A.J. Smith, a grizzled old veteran, but a soldier all through. They all four greeted each other eagerly, but Thomas, undemonstrative as he was, literally took Smith in his arms and hugged him, For now, he was absolutely sure of coping with Hood and defeating him duly. They first discussed Franklin and rejoiced over it, and then Thomas spread his maps on the floor and pointed out his Nashville lines, explaining their bearings and significance. I left them at 1 a.m., all four down on their knees and examining attentively the positions to be assumed the next morning as Schofield and Wood fell back on Nashville and Smith marched out from the Cumberland. What a great scene. Imagine Thomas and three other generals, Schofield, Wood, and Smith, all down on their knees looking at maps in the wee hours of the night before Nashville. Wow, what a view. And Thomas, of course, the usual quiet man hugging General A.J. Smith. Now, I'll end with a summary of Thomas's character, this again coming from Rusling's Recollections. Rusling says, while modest and unassuming beyond most men, Thomas was also conscious of his own great qualities and knew that as a commander, he was head and shoulders above General John Logan or any other volunteer officer. So, when his commission as Major General, USA, reached him, while in pursuit of Hood, according to an officer present, he cast it aside in his tent with the remark, quote, I earned that a year ago at Chattanooga, end quote, alluding to Sherman's promotion there over his head, which he never quite forgave. I saw much of General Thomas during all this Nashville campaign and afterward, 1865 to 1866. He was an upright Christian gentleman as well as a great soldier, and a purer patriot or nobler officer or worthier American this republic has not yet produced since the days of George Washington. So there you have the recollections of James Fowler Rusling, of George Henry Thomas, Old Pap, the Rock of Chickamauga, and a man, according to Rusling, similar to George Washington. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research.